Good afternoon, folks, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Brad Wolfenden, and I'm here with EmberSec. We're excited to have you as we run through today's live webinar on enhancing security controls with application whitelisting. This presentation was actually designed for us to present at the HIMSS conference, Health Information and Management Systems Society, that was to be held down in Orlando just a couple of months ago. But unfortunately, with the current circumstances, the conference was canceled, and we decided to repurpose a lot of the hard work and research that our team has put into the application whitelisting research and implementation, integration. A few reminders as we get started today. Your microphones have been muted and will remain muted for the duration of today's session. With that said, you'll find a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Please do engage with us through that chat box if you have any questions that we can get to. We will be wrapping up with a Q&A, so we plan to save time to get back and respond to anything that you lob our way. And then last but not least, today's session will be recorded and shared. So we'll be sure to follow up with you via email with a link to access today's session. And you're more than welcome to share that with those you work with that you think would be interested in our presentation. And if questions come up at a later date, there will be some contact information that we'll share with you at the end of today's presentation, so you can follow up with us with any specific questions that you may have. Before I introduce our panelists for today, I thought I'd run through a quick agenda of what we'll be discussing. So as I mentioned, today's session is all on application whitelisting, but to sort of set the stage, we'll talk a little bit about the current threat landscape across the cybersecurity space, some specific industries and verticals and the associated threats therein. From there, we'll give you a little bit of background on security controls, talk about what they are and how you might look to choose more appropriate security controls for your organization or your enterprise based off your industry, maybe some different compliance efforts or mandates that you're up against. And then we'll dive into application whitelisting itself and have a couple of demo videos that one of our panelists has put together for you. We'll be walking through a bit of a case study and show you a bit of a case study around what an attack or an infection might look like with and then without application whitelisting deployed. And then, as I mentioned, we have saved some time at the end of today's session where we will offer up a bit of a panel discussion and a Q&A. So again, just a reminder, feel free to share some questions in that chat box. My colleague Hunter will be moderating that chat box and making sure that we have those questions queued up for these two gentlemen here. So without further ado, I will introduce you to both Mr. Ken Jenkins and Mr. Jimmy Bain. Ken is the CTO of Bylight and principal lead here at EmberSec. He comes to us with 20+ years of information technology experience with a background in red teaming, pen testing, hunting, threat emulation, incident response, and systems engineering. Ken is an avid capture the flag competitor, a technical mentor for the Cyber Patriot program, and involved in lots of extracurriculars, one of most important being a father. And next up, we have Mr. Jimmy Bain. Jimmy is a security consultant here at EmberSec. He comes to us with quite a bit of public and private IT security experience, mostly focused around security research, penetration testing, red teaming, security analysis, and systems engineering. He's also a contributor to the Living Off the Lands Binaries and Scripts project, an occasional blog. And Jimmy, too, a new father himself. So with that, Ken, I will pass it over to you to give a little background on Bylight and EmberSec and kick things off.
Hey, Brad, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. So a little bit about Bylight. Bylight is a full spectrum professional IT services company that provides support to public and private sector clients. Our service and capabilities include network architecture, engineering and design, hardware and software solutions, managed service, technical services, and consulting. EmberSec is a business unit within Bylight that's responsible for delivering advanced cybersecurity services. Those services include technical, managed, and governance risk and compliance. Our technical services are red teaming, pen testing, vulnerability assessments, and threat emulation. Our managed detection and response capabilities are email threat protection, endpoint detection and response, network security monitoring, and SIEM management. Our GRC team also is a third-party or assessor organization for HITRUST. So the team was built out of senior security researchers, operators, hunters, intelligence professionals, and military. Next slide. So today, before we jump into our talk on application whitelisting, I want to kind of just paint a picture on the current threat landscape. So on the right here, you see a lot of names for malware or viruses, but truly there's many threats, and there's categorized by hackers, malware, ransomware, which we'll be focused on a little bit today, nation state hackers who are a little more advanced, and usually have some pretty or well funded and have advanced agendas, insider threats, and shadow IT. We will also cover a bit about some security controls that can be put in place, and we'll just touch on each of those and talk about defense in depth, and then show you a few places where application whitelisting would really help. Next slide. So ransomware is really on the rise. It's a disruptive malware. It's used to extort payments from victims. So how do you do that? So the adversary will encrypt. He will gain access, and he will encrypt files on hard drives or on network shares, and the victim will request to send payment, generally using some type of cryptocurrency, in order to get a decryption key. One thing that's kind of on the rise is, organizations are starting to not pay these ransoms more and more, because the last thing you want to do is set a precedence that you could expect payment if if this continues. So essentially, we'd be incentivizing these types of attacks. So one thing to note about ransomware specifically is no sector is immune from it. So here you see the government at the top, 27%, and this is all based on a report from SC Magazine and Trend Micro. So again, no sector is immune. Also, ransomware is delivered through many attack vectors, which include email, known security flaws, social engineering, or breaches. Next slide. So the impact of ransomware can be pretty intense and devastating. So there's loss of business, financial loss, inability to conduct business continuity or put in business continuity a threat. So I want to take a couple minutes here and kind of go through three recent ransomware scenarios. So back in 2016, MedStar Health was using JBoss. So this is a Red Hat product used to develop custom software and custom tools that can be deployed pretty rapidly across an organization. So JBoss is routinely misconfigured or allowing unauthorized outside users to gain control. This vulnerability had been disclosed and discussed by the government and Red Hat specifically, dating all the way back to 2007 and again in 2010. And in this case, with MedStar, it really just needed a security patch and configuration looked at. So the result here was the adversary caused their email servers to be shut down, and their electronic health record capabilities were also diminished. So in this case, the adversary gained access to that healthcare data. MedStar did not pay the ransom, even though the ransom was kind of small compared to other attacks, is about $19,000, but did switch to paper. This required them to switch to paper systems, and they had to reduce patient volume as a result. So their business was truly impacted. Second was Grays Harbor Community Hospital in Aberdeen, Washington. In this case, databases containing healthcare records were hit by ransomware. and also the adversary, requested Bitcoin in the amount of $1 million US. In the end, the FBI eventually recommended that the hospital not pay the ransom. In this case, also the hospital had cyber insurance, but still, again, apparently refused. They ended up using a backup recovery process, and although it wasn't a seamless recovery, they were able to recover. Next is ASCO. ASCO is an airplanes parts manufacturer in Belgium with operations in the United States. In this case, ASCO had just been acquired as a part of a merger and acquisition. They were pretty tight-lipped on what was going on with the activity, but it caused serious disruption in operations in Belgium, Canada, US, and Germany. There are around 1,000 employees that had to be placed on temporary leave in order to recover from the attack. So also the company shut down plants for several days to recover and reestablish business continuity. So as you can see, these are three pretty significant ones that impacted, two in the healthcare community and one in the manufacturing, two in the healthcare sector and one in the manufacturing sector. So next slide. So how do we address these cyber threats? So it'd be nice to say there's an easy way, but really it's defense in depth. It has to be done through policies and procedures, various security assessments, continuous security operations, and then various controls across your enterprise. But the one we really want to focus on is endpoint controls. So those are your workstations, your servers, and so forth. So that's kind of what we'll focus our attention at over the coming slides and conversation. So next slide. So I believe one of the best places to really counter ransomware is on the endpoint. So endpoint, again, being workstations, laptops, servers. And in this case, it's a combined approach. It's a layered approach. Some of these you may not be able to fully implement, but I think if you look across these few items here and you make an attempt to implement some of these, you could have a good layered approach to countering ransomware. So traditional antivirus, that still remains very useful, especially if the malware has been around and there's there's signatures that exist, or it exhibits heuristic behaviors from other malware that's been used before. So AV is still very relevant. Next is endpoint detection and response. You'll hear some refer to this as next generation antivirus, but really what it's for is detecting, investigating activities while leveraging threat intelligence, but also providing more advanced threat protection capability. Then data loss prevention is a really good one. This prevents sensitive data from being stolen, mishandled, sent out in the wrong locations. So if this is deployed correctly, it can really limit the damage that could occur. Using role-based access and whatnot. Next is the host-based firewalls. So host-based firewalls can be useful. The problem here, though, is you would either have to know the command and control domains that this ransomware calls back, or the IP addresses. But the way it really can help a ransomware is kind of knocking down the adversary's ability to to conduct lateral movement and spread ransomware. If all else fails, you're going to need things like backups. So in this case, backups, if your files do become encrypted and you can't get the decryption key, you may have to revert to backups. So one thing to mention with all these things is this is a proactive, iterative approach. You can't deploy these and just let them sit. They require constant feeding and caring. And then the final thing, probably the most advanced capability, is application whitelisting. This prevents unapproved or non-approved applications from executing. So these are all types of these are all the things that address how can we raise the cost to the adversary and reduce that attack surface. You start at the endpoint and you use these different capabilities with a layered approach. So I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Jimmy Bain, and he's going to kind of touch on some more advanced features of application whitelisting. Jimmy?
Thanks, Ken. Yes, so one of the major security controls that could really boost the not only endpoint security of your organization, but really enterprise-wide security, and really, if configured correctly, can stop a lot of threat agents. Many a red teamer will say that the one thing that they have the hardest battle to overcome is typically application whitelisting. So let's define application whitelisting. So what exactly is it? It really is an approach for application control. And when people refer to application whitelisting, they actually typically mean application control. And application whitelisting consists of configuring and using different application control policies to allow the execution of approved code, programs, software. You can also use block rules. They are mildly encouraged to a degree. But at the end of the day, the goal is to find what you want approved an organization to run, and you block by exception, and you pretty much approve only what you want to run. The idea is to capture as many implicit deny aspects and opportunities versus explicit block rules, because that could leave you in a world of pain later as you develop your different policies for your organization. There's a lot of technical debt that could accumulate as a result. So application whitelisting is very underutilized in most organizations. That's primarily because there's a learning curve. Enforcing application whitelisting is not easy. It does take time to implement properly and robustly. The one nice thing about application whitelisting is that the cost to the organization may actually have already been bundled into security product that you already own. For instance, if you're running an enterprise version of Windows since effectively 2003 XP, but we should be seeing 10 or more on the endpoints these days, the enterprise versions of operating systems have some sort of application whitelisting capability. In third-party products, we typically find that there are application control features, but they're usually disabled. Next slide, please. So a few examples of application whitelisting solutions that are out there. Carbon Black has an application whitelisting capability in their CB Protect product. McAfee, Trend Micro, Manage Engine also have different application control capabilities as well. Open source, Red Hat based FA Policy D for your Linux hosts. And then in the Microsoft world, we have three main solutions. Microsoft started their application control journey way back in the Windows 2003 family line of operating systems, which includes Windows XP. SRP was a decent approach to probably get into what has become a more advanced ecosystem with AppLocker and vendor application control, but it really just does not have the robustness of the other two. But with that said, it really does help in a pinch if you need to block a program or a certain file from running in the enterprise. This has actually been replaced in favor by software restriction policies version 2 that we actually know it as AppLocker. AppLocker is a very approachable application whitelisting solution and is the replacement for SRP since Windows 2008, Windows 7 line of operating systems. AppLocker is great because you can manage it in group policy or via the local security policy. It actually comes with a pretty decent rule set, a default rule set that is excellent for baselining and testing. I would say if you're new to application whitelisting or if you haven't implemented it prior, AppLocker is probably the best solution to start with. It's easier to manage. There's a nice GUI component in group policy that allows you to create and deploy those policies. And AppLocker will be the primary subject of our webinar today when we get into our demos. With that said, we definitely want to discuss briefly Windows Defender application control. This is actually probably the premier application control solution on the market. It's very robust. It actually restricts code at a kernel level, and that actually restricts not only kernel code, but user mode code as well. It really locks down operating system components with really great restrictions. And the goal typically with Windows Defender Application Control is to minimize unsigned code. And where we see this is that as adversaries get more advanced, executing code, defenses have to get better. So Defender Application Control actually restricts some of the more operating system components from running without having necessarily to restrict the full component itself, like a particular binary. The main issue with Defender Application Control in its current form is that it's very difficult to manage. It doesn't have the nice easy button features like AppLocker does in terms of deploying policies. So deploying policies require a more manual work. But at the end of the day, I would say that if you venture down the application control journey, I think Windows Defender Application Control should ultimately be the pinnacle point where you're trying to reach. So that could take years of maturity. But hopefully as time moves on, Windows Defender Application Control will also become more approachable. Next slide, please. So in AppLocker, we have different components that allow us to help create our policies. So before I dive into some of these, just to show you on the right of the screen here, we have our group policy editor. Again, this can also be controlled in the group policy management console for the domain. You can deploy multiple policies across your organization for your different OUs and sites if you prefer. But what's really nice about this is that it really makes it easy to not only get granular, but to also control at a higher level to start with default rules, which we will be doing shortly. So there are basically 4 major components to not only create and apply rules, but you have to kind of target what you want to do with your application control policy, and that goes back to the planning in your organization. So with the rules, we can allow or block based on executables. So think of like your .exe files and .com files, and then we can block or allow certain window installer packages. So think of like your MSI packages or your transform files. We can block or allow certain types of scripts. This includes PowerShell scripts, batch files, Visual Basic, and JScripts as well. There's a rule set for DLLs and OCX files. These will enforce or allow certain libraries. And then we have another for packaged apps. These would prevent or allow you to install, say, things from like the Windows App Store, or prevent or allow some side loading techniques. For conditions, conditions are the criteria that AppLocker rule is pretty much based. So we can apply rules by a publisher, path, or hash, file hash. A publisher rule is, or I should say, I'm sorry, a condition, a published condition, is to an audit or enforced by a software publisher. And in order for this to be accomplished, files must be digitally signed by the publisher or an internal CA in order to be approved for running if you're applying with a publisher condition. Rule publisher conditions can be quite granular and then certainly include various attributes of a binary resource as well. So, it's not just if it's signed by Microsoft allowed to run, you can specify other criteria as well. Path rules are interesting. You can restrict or allow by certain paths. So think of like productivity tools for most of your users. You probably want your program files directory, programs in those directories to run in general. So that's very very important. But at the same time, it can get a little finicky if you try to like block, say, a particular file. So path rules, if you apply a block rule, say, for a particular executable, then that where that executable resides in a directory structure might have other implications. So you might have to have exceptions to the rule to allow other things to run, and that's kind of where the whitelisting rules can start getting a little bit difficult to manage. So you really have to sort of define what you really want to run and what you do not want to run, and try to build your policies that preferably with more implicit deny opportunities versus explicit deny to minimize any sort of conflicts and open gaps. The last condition is a file hash condition, and that's literally enforcing by some hash value, I believe a SHA value in this case. The caveat here is that if you block by hash, if the file's changed in any other way, or if the binary is updated, that hash rule really doesn't have much of an effect. So those rules are typically good for times we need to block in a pinch. There are two types of actions. This allows us to either allow or deny based on our rule conditions. Allow is permitting the action based on a rule condition, and deny is preventing. In general, as I already stated, we want to try to allow by exception and deny by default. With that said, we want to minimize explicit deny rules if we can. For modes, we have two modes that are applied or can be applied. The first is enforced, and this is what we typically associate with application whitelisting, allow, block certain things from running. But audit is quite powerful. You don't have to block with application whitelisting. Audit's great because it's a logging feature. It'll log the action that it would have taken otherwise, whether that been a block or allow. And not only is it great for baselining, but even if you use application whitelisting as a complement to, say, another solution like your EDR solution, it's a great source of data and telemetry to enable your security operations. Next slide, please. So as I already said, AppLocker has a feature which is very nice called default rules. Default rules default rules can be created for the 5 rule set criteria. That's the executables, the Windows installer, packages, scripts, DLLs, and the package tabs. And this is what I would highly recommend when you start your application whitelisting journey to work off of these to baseline and test. Default rules can be, in fact, created under that group policy manager. In particular, for each rule set, right-click, and you can actually click to create the default rules, and the default rules, as shown at the bottom of the screen, will auto-populate. It is worthy to note that these rule conditions by default do not restrict admin activity. Restricting admin activity, depending on how you look at it, could be a good or bad thing. Again, this is why it needs to be planned out in your organization. If you're looking to perform any sort of application control at an admin level, you really should take a look at Defender Application Control. They are able to perform certain restrictions at a level that are not as easy to circumvent, even as an administrator. That really goes back to planning. So the one great thing that AppLocker in particular does, it actually also enforces a feature called constrained language mode for PowerShell for non-administrators. What happens there is that there are certain types of PowerShell functionality, such as types and different levels of code access that are restricted, so an attacker or a prospective insider couldn't leverage the attack surface that we've seen in recent years that PowerShell brings. It really reduces that attack surface. So a real nice feature there. Not a perfect solution. It doesn't enforce we call code integrity, but again, a great start to definitely help prevent potentially a use of PowerShell, say like on the client side, if a user leverages like a macro in a Word doc or an Excel spreadsheet. Next slide, please. AppLocker events are stored in the event log. For quick review and triage, you can access that through the path on the screen there. Drill down through the event viewer, then to application and service logs, Microsoft Windows AppLocker. You'll see the actions taken on behalf of the enforced or audited AppLocker policy. In this case, we have a program called evil.com that was prevented from running out of the downloads directory. Definitely some good telemetry there to push to your SEM. Again, we certainly recommend that as an ingested data source to complement your EDR solutions. Next slide, please. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what AppLocker could potentially do for us, we're going to walk through a series of demos back to back to back. Demo 1 will actually infect a host with a ransomware, sample ransomware that we created in-house. Then we're actually going to walk through and show you how we can quickly apply a default AppLocker policy for the local machine. And then we're going to use that policy to walk through the same steps that we infected the machine in demo 1 to see how AppLocker can actually block the infection. So without further ado, let's jump into demo 1. All right, so here in demo 1, we have a user that apparently likes cats. He was redirected to this cat video site. This page that displayed a link to download the video player in order to watch these videos. Well, clicking the link, he downloaded the file to run Windows Smart Screen, which is actually a nice feature for sanity check to hopefully prevent the user from moving forward to running the application, but you could bypass that with ease. So in this case, after he opened the file, nothing happened yet because the crypter is running in the background. And then, as you can see on the desktop, all the files changed, the background changed. This software is now holding this machine for ransom. In order to reclaim access to those files, whether IT can restore or not, you need to input a passcode here, a decryption key, effectively, after paying ransom for some websites. So go visit this link. We will get you your decryption key, input the decryption key, and that'll work. In this case, our key is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're just demonstrating that in this case, our attackers are very kind and they actually gave us the proper key so we could decrypt. All right, and any second now, we should see it kind of pop back. There we go. So that's good. And we can confirm with the box. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's create a quick policy. So in this case, we're going to create a local group policy to enforce AppLocker locally, not in the domain. So we'll go to our local group policy editor, and we will drill down to our AppLocker configuration capability. That's under Windows settings, security settings, application control policies, and then AppLocker. All right, so one of the things that we need to do is to ensure that we enable DLL rules. That's actually in a different tab. There's actually a message here that states that it could cause performance issues on a machine. I can assure you that's likely not the case, but we want to account for those DLL rules, so we want to enable that setting. So then we go through each of those rule sets, and we right-click and enable the default rules. And then from there, we'll ensure that they are in enforce mode and are configured. And it looks like we're good. We'll apply those settings. Then we will confirm the DLL rules are in fact enforced, which is good. Now we need to start the application identity service. This service actually enables AppLocker to do enforcement. And in this case, we may also need to update group policy with GP update. But in this case, we didn't have to do that. The policy refreshed prior. So, all right, and everything looks good. We're running. Next slide, please. All right, so back to our user. He's going to walk through and perform the same steps. He's going to click the link. He's going to ignore the prompt, sanity prompt that he should get through the smart screen filter. And he's going to try to run this application so he can see some cats. And he was prevented. That's great. So here we see that AppLocker, the default rules in this case prevented this particular attack, which is great. Next slide, please. So a couple of things to consider before going down this journey of implementing application whitelisting. I want to say that it is a great solution because it really can be effective and it can work. But it isn't perfect. There are some bypasses. If you Google some things out there on the internet, if you look for AppLocker bypass or WDAC bypass, you'll see some really great research that researchers have discovered methods for circumventing rule sets. There's really rule sets in a few ways. There's rule sets in implementation, which is how you set your policies. If there are too many deny rules, there might be gaps in path rule subversions, or you might have missed something that could be abused. And there are other, I would say, more advanced research where you would use signed binaries to execute unsigned arbitrary code. In your research as you perform to look at these things, because you might want to block some of these things or try to set rules to minimize, at least be able to detect around those things if you can't block them in an application whitelisting policy. It's good due diligence, and you'll understand, what you would have to account for, and you would have to apply that to what works in your organization. Implementing application whitelisting is a major project. Most orgs don't tackle it because it's hard. It takes time. You might not have the time. If your organization only has a few security people and they're constantly doing continuous monitoring, or they're always chasing other issues. Implementing that kind of project might not be easy. So we say start small. Typically, we want to see, in an organization, we say, pick a group, maybe a small team of 5 to 10 people. I would say start with a group that uses standard productivity apps. So say their requirements are minimal. Typically, they just need web access, maybe Microsoft Office, and see, and if they're very approachable, see if you can do a 2 to 4 week trial with them in an enforce mode. Everywhere else, enable log mode and complement your EDR. And use those baseline policies and start from there. If you're particularly interested in AppLocker, I highly encourage you to follow a gentleman named Odvar Mo on Twitter. He's actually done some really great case studies and actually has built some very robust policies that, with a caveat, of course, to implement what's good in your organization, what works in your organization. But if you wanted to test some of those policies out, that could give you a flavor of the power of AppLocker and what it can really do. So that's all I had. Thank you for allowing me to present, and I'll hand it back over to Brad.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate all of your time and effort put into putting together these slides. Ken, it was great to hear a little bit about some of the different threat landscape and defense in depth, and hopefully everyone learned something from your overview and introduction there. And Jimmy, it's always fun to see in real time some of your talents and skills, and I appreciate the visuals of the demo. So thanks again, gentlemen. It looks like we have received a couple of questions coming in from those attending today's session. So I want to go through these and start to ask you guys, if you wouldn't mind, we will get started with one for you, Jimmy. And Jimmy, this question is, how often do you see application whitelisting when you perform assessments?
That's a good question. The truth is not very often, and when we do see it, it's typically very sparse. I think we see a lot of attempts to like block an application, by a path rule or something like that, and we see a lot of like disabled command prompts, cmd.exe or disabled PowerShell, and a lot of the subversion techniques behind those is very simple, and a lot of times is you can copy something in another directory, or you could use an alternate method to leverage it in a way that it's approved. So beyond that, it is not utilized very much, but I surely hope, and I plan on, as an offensive security professional, to see more of it in the future and prepare for my engagements accordingly.
Great. The next one here, Ken, I'll lob your way. It looks like this individual represents the healthcare industry, and they're curious, what do you see as the most common threats to healthcare?
Hey, thanks, Brad. So if I understand the question correctly, it's what do you see as the most common threat in our industry within healthcare? So I would say it's probably vulnerability management. The lack of continuous patching. I think those are probably some of the largest ones, and those specifically are really, what fall, those companies fall prey to ransomware attacks, because if you have a bunch of vulnerabilities, eventually an adversary is going to get in there, and without application whitelisting, eventually they're going to get code execution. If they get code execution, they're likely to be able to decrypt your files. So similar to what Jimmy said, we see a little bit of application whitelisting, but generally it's not too mature. It's something that just has to continuously be improved upon, and before you can really get serious about it, you got to have vulnerability management in place.
Interesting. And a shameless plug here for the EmberSec blog. We did recently post a piece on IT and OT security in the healthcare space, and talked a little bit about some of the threats we see, especially with integrating various systems and technologies, and some of the modernization of medical devices and whatnot. So encourage this individual that asked about threats to the healthcare industry to check out our blog. And then last but not least, just kind of a general one, and I'll lob this at each of you gentlemen. Maybe we'll start with you, Jimmy. For someone just looking to implement application whitelisting as a new security control, what would you give them as one piece of advice, or something to look out for as a beginner or just starting out?
Certainly, I would say it's probably more holistic than it is for practical implementation. But a 40% solution is still better than no solution at all. So as you move along that journey and establish milestones to build these policies or implement application whitelisting in the organization, definitely set goals and celebrate those goals along the way. You may not have reached the complete coverage that you want, but you can certainly start small, build from there, and still benefit from the security pluses that it would, even a 40% solution would give you versus having none at all.
Understood. Thanks, Jimmy. How about you, Ken? Any last words of wisdom to share with our crowd today?
Yeah, for sure. So I think Jimmy touched on some great points. I think the key starting point to get for application whitelisting is understanding your threat model, like who is coming after you, who poses a risk or threats to your organization, and then focus on what are business applications that you really need, and create an approved software list. That approved software list will definitely help drive your application whitelisting journey. I think also with application whitelisting, you do have to start small. Maybe there's some very simple milestones that you want to start with. Maybe it's just, hey, we've decided we're going to use Microsoft solution, or we're going to use our endpoint detection and response solution that has it built in. But make a decision, run with it, use input from the organization with your approved software list, and I think that's really how you get started with it.
Great, wonderful. Well, gentlemen, appreciate that. And as we wrap up here, like I promised, sharing some contact information with you all. Feel free to reach out to the EmberSec team if you have any questions on what you learned today, or anything else that might come up in terms of your cybersecurity program, implementing new practices, needing assessments, things like that. You can also find us on Twitter as well as LinkedIn. We have a pretty active social media presence. In addition to those two outlets, also publishing new blog posts quite frequently on some of the latest and greatest trends, research, news, and other hot topics that come across our radar. So thanks again for joining us today. Thanks again to Ken and Jimmy for all of your hard work preparing our slides and dialing in that presentation. And we'll hope to see you on our next webinar. Have a great afternoon and stay safe and healthy.